Happy Sunday, everyone. Hope you are all doing great. Today, we're tackling the topic of whether we're required, as part of our faith, to agree with our adversaries. This is kind of a loaded question that we can come at from different angles depending on how we're going to interpret that question or that commandment. Comes from the Beatitudes, the Sermon on the Mount, when Jesus is teaching a number of kind of contrarian principles, contrary to a lot of the law of Moses interpreted, practices and doctrines that they had. Now, a few months ago, I did a musing on why Latter-day Saints should be contentious. If you didn't see that, you can scroll down in my YouTube channel, or you can go to sundaymusings.org, and you can just type in contention or contentious, and you'll find it. In that musing, I was making the case that we ought to be contentious, righteously and appropriately contentious, not with the spirit of contention to try and be purposefully divisive, but that Jesus himself said, right, I didn't come to bring a sword, or I didn't come to bring peace, but a sword. The truth divides, that we should contend for righteousness and for truth, knowing that that will be divisive, or at least perceived to be divisive by those who take it the truth to be hard, for it cutteth them to the very center, right? So in that musing, I talked about the need for contention. I shared several scriptures talking about contending for the faith and contending against the devil and so forth. One of the questions that I got was, how do we square that idea with the commandment from Christ to agree with our adversaries? If we are supposed to be contentious, if we're supposed to contend against others and stand up for truth and fight back those who are spreading evil and so forth, then how do we square that with what Jesus has said? So let's look at that verse. It comes to us from Matthew chapter 5, where it says this: "Agree with thine adversary quickly while thou art in the way with him, lest at any time he shall get thee, and thou shalt be cast into prison." Now, of course, there's the kind of dual layered approach, potentially layered approach to this, where, you can look at it from a very logistical, operational perspective about not getting into altercations with other people, lest they go report you to the, chief prosecutor, to the judge, you get cast into prison. Let's not let conflicts, get out of hand, because then you can be legitimately thrown in prison and have punitive consequences come upon you. So there's that superficial layer to look at it. Obviously, there's the spiritual layer as well, right? Where the prison is spirit prison, where the judge is Heavenly Father, Christ, being our judge. And so you can look at it with that layer as well. Now, there certainly is a superficial or surface layer interpretation that is fairly prevalent when it comes to trying to understand what this verse of Scripture is teaching us. What does it mean to agree with our adversary quickly? And many people, if you go online, especially look at general Christian commentary on this verse, what you'll find, as I did, is a lot of sentiment. I'll call it go along to get along, right? Make nice with others. This niceness doctrine, suburban nicety, right? Where you don't want to rock the boat, you don't want to create contention and controversy. There's obviously a spectrum of opinion here. Not everyone online that I found was saying to just go along to get along. There were people I'll just read briefly from this one website I found. They said that agreeing with your adversary isn't about conceding defeat or overlooking wrongs. It's about seeking a swift resolution and prioritizing reconciliation over prolonged conflict. Keep in mind that word reconciliation for a little bit later when we get into some of the deeper meaning here. So there's kind of this spectrum of opinion. Is it agree with your adversary, don't rock the boat, don't upset people, don't cause contention, because you don't want them to pull you in front of a judge, or you don't want to have bad feelings, and you don't want to not be able to spread the gospel, and all these downstream ramifications, right? So there's this spectrum, this broad range of views, but a lot of people centering on this, I'll call it again a surface level interpretation of agreeing with your adversary. Now, that spectrum of opinion, there was a diversity of perspectives, as I said. So I was then curious, what have church leaders said about this verse to expound upon it, to clarify it, to give context to it? Not much, as it turns out. I to do research for this question, used a resource I've shared in the past, scriptures.byu.edu, where what they do is they take like general conference talks and so forth, and they will extract all the footnotes and tie it to the verses being cited. So in this case, I went there and I looked up Matthew 5:25, and then it shows you who has referenced that in their material. There's only 4 references since the founding of the church, the early days. So in the modern time, there's only 4 references, and 3 of those 4 references were just including the agree with thine adversary and a broader list of commandments from Jesus, right? So they'd say, oh, he was teaching about this and that, and that, and that, and that. There's only 1 reference in like the past century plus that had any type of exposition on this verse of any kind, whether surface level or more substantive. That reference, the sole reference, comes from David Sorensen. He was in the presidency of the 70 in 2003 when he said the following.
The Savior said, agree with thine adversary quickly while thou art in the way with him, thus commanding us to resolve our differences early on, lest the passions of the moment escalate into physical or emotional cruelty, and we fall captive to our anger.
Okay, so again, this is talking about resolution, right? Commanding us to resolve our differences so that you don't let things get out of hand, becoming captive to your anger. You don't want things to escalate. That seems to be what Elder Sorensen is talking about. Interestingly enough, in the New Testament Institute Manual, for this verse, this reference to Elder Sorensen's talk is the answer, trying to say, what does this mean? And then it gives that quote that we just listened to. So that's it. Like no one else has really addressed or talked about any level of detail of like what this means and how does it work and how are we to understand this and how should we be operating today. Now that's just in general conference. I did find another reference from a BYU commencement address from Elder Robert Hales, Quorum of the 12. Interestingly enough, also in 2003, the same year that Elder Sorensen gave his conference, general conference address. Here's what Elder Hales had to say about it.
From a tiny spark can come great conflagration. In the course of moving forward, it is natural to generate a few sparks. Misunderstandings, differences of opinion, and diverse personalities and styles can produce friction. Remember, if we are not careful, little things can easily become big things. Decide now to extinguish the sparks of conflict by thinking well of others and being kind to others. As the Lord taught, agree with thine adversary quickly while thou art in the way with him. Don't criticize. Don't murmur. What you say about others may and usually does get back to them. See the good in people and develop that goodness by your own unwavering friendship, acceptance, loyalty, trust, and love.
So again, this perspective centers around the idea of not wanting conflict to escalate. It effectively is adding a layer to Jesus's teachings of de-escalation, or giving it that context or that interpretation, right? You want to agree quickly because you want to extinguish the sparks of conflict. You don't want to, fan the flames. You don't want those sparks to become a big, fire, right? So that is what limited exposition and interpretation we have seems to focus on this idea of not wanting problems to get bigger. Agree quickly because you don't want things to blow up. Again, the verse says, agree quickly, lest at any time the adversary shall get thee and you'll be cast into prison. Perhaps then inferring that means you don't want things to escalate into going to prison, so let's try and solve things quickly with your adversary. But does that mean that agreeing with our adversary requires accommodating the adversary, supporting our adversary? Right? You might feel, as I often do, that we're commanded to resist evil, to not agree with it, with our adversary, to not support it, accommodate it. We're supposed to resist evil. Interestingly enough, in the same sermon, Jesus says to resist not evil. That's from verse 39 of Matthew 5. And what's so interesting to me is I struggle with like Old and New Testament teachings where they've just the essence has been boiled down and we don't really have a lot of the context. It's like reading Isaiah or whatever, right? Or even much of the Old Testament. It's like if you don't deeply understand the historical nuances, the cultural references, and so forth, it's really hard to like get the intended meaning. And so we bring to it our modern sense, as we do with this word agree. I'll touch on this in just a second. And we have our modern context and our modern definitions. And it's like, well, isn't the point of scriptures to understand what the Lord and what these prophets were teaching in the context of the time? It's like the Constitution. Do you really want to just interpret it based on some Supreme Court justice, 15 years ago? Or do you want to try and get at what the founders themselves were intending when they used those words? Obviously, I favor the latter, but I feel like with the scriptures, many times people are not able, myself included, to fully understand that historical context and culture and nuance in a way that helps us understand what the words are actually trying to convey. So yeah, Jesus says to resist not evil, right? But elsewhere, in James chapter 4, it says resist the devil. And in that previous musing talking about being contentious, I shared a number of scriptures where the Lord, like in D&C 18, contend against no church save it be the church of the devil. You're supposed to contend against the church of the devil. You're supposed to resist evil. You're supposed to waste and wear out your lives in bringing to light hidden things of darkness. Be anxiously engaged in a good cause, bring to pass much righteousness. These things necessarily imply that you're resisting evil by trying to bring forth the light. You're trying to shut out the dark and resist it. And so it's fascinating to try and understand this verse, which I think many of us struggle with. We lack the clarity from modern church leaders really to try and suss this out a little bit. General Christendom, I would say, is similarly struggling to really understand what Jesus is trying to say here. I by no means am the authoritative official interpreter of Jesus's meaning, but I want to more deeply understand it. Before we move on to this different interpretation that I'll offer, let's go to Paul in Ephesians 6, again talking about, or at least referencing this idea of, are we to resist evil or agree with it? If we're agreeing with our adversary, what does it mean in context of fighting off or resisting or not resisting evil? Here's from Paul. He says, for we wrestle not against flesh and blood, but against principalities, against powers, against the rulers of the darkness of this world, against spiritual wickedness in high places. Wherefore take unto you the whole armor of God, that you may be able to withstand in the evil day, and having done all, to stand. Stand therefore, having your loins girt about with truth, and having on the breastplate of righteousness, and so on and so on and so on. That just the resistance there, standing as you're being bombarded by all this stuff. Stand with the armor of God. You're being girt about with the truth. You have this defensive armor. You're trying to withstand the evil day. So you're wrestling against the rulers of the darkness of the world, right? Spiritual wickedness. And so that to me implies that there is some resistance. I think, for example, I wrote about this in my Christ versus Caesar book. I was fascinated as I dove into this question of when Jesus, he's saying, resist not evil, right? And if anyone shall smite thee, then turn the other cheek also. And again, we bring these modern definitions and the lack of like context and history and culture to try and understand this. And so we come up with very different meanings than what were actually intended. For example, when Jesus says to turn the other cheek, that's almost been turned into this trite little, turn the other cheek, meaning like if someone does something bad, just let them keep doing something bad to you. It's this passive, defeatist almost approach to aggression from other people. It's this very kind of pacifist, submissive approach. If someone harms you, turn the other cheek and let them just keep going at it. And that again is like the surface level interpretation that we often get. But as I dove into some of the history and culture, I found, I don't remember who it was from, but this different cultural context that made it make a lot more sense. That in the old world, the left hand was considered unclean. You did your, business and everything with the right hand, shaking hands and so forth. And so there was this cultural perception that the left hand was unclean. Therefore, if someone were to, like, if I'm standing opposite you and I go to punch you, right, and I punch you on your left cheek, then if you were to turn your other cheek, you're giving me your right cheek, right? Because the verse specifically calls out the side of the cheek. It doesn't say, a cheek singular. It says, like, turn your right cheek. And so that's signaling something. There's something purposeful about the side of the cheek. So if I'm going to hit you on your right side of the cheek, now I'm having to do a backhanded slap, which was something that you would do to someone who is sorry, I'm getting this backwards. So that if you're turning the other cheek, right, then you're having to treat the other person as equal. So if I'm approaching you with like a backhanded slap, then you are submissive, you are subordinate, right? I am better than you. But that when you turn your other cheek, requiring me to then hit you, right, to turn your left cheek, if you turn your left cheek, then now I have to hit you, which means that you're my social equal, right? You're not this like backhanded, you're my property, you're my slave, my wife, my whatever in the old world, right? Instead, it's I am your social equal. And so by turning my left cheek, I'm saying if you're going to hit me again, it's going to be on terms of us both being children of God, socially equal, and all the rest. So I found that very interesting because when you layer this just little bit of cultural context on top of the teaching about the perception of the left hand being unclean, the backhanded nature being kind of a subordinate thing, the punch being kind of a socially equal thing or whatever, that to me is like, okay, suddenly maybe Jesus isn't saying to be completely passive and just let yourself be aggressed upon. Maybe it's about asserting your divine heritage. Maybe it's about you asserting yourself as a child of God, as the equal of the other person, and saying, if you're going to continue to do this, you will, respect me, or whatever little nugget you want to extrapolate from that. It's just suggesting something very different than that superficial interpretation. Oh, just submit and let them keep beating upon you, right? And like, maybe that's the right interpretation. It's certainly the most prevalent one. Maybe for some reason that still is, but that cultural context to me gives it way more interesting meaning and insight to say, how does that apply to my life today? So too with Jesus's teaching that we should agree quickly with our adversary. Maybe there's some different analysis or context or something that will change our perception about what Jesus was actually saying. So in order to talk about that, we first need to set the stage. Now, Greek, the Greek language was the dominant language of the Eastern Mediterranean following the conquest of Alexander the Great, centuries before the New Testament was composed. Even under Roman rule, Greek was a very common tongue, especially in like Judea, Syria, Egypt, and elsewhere. And so the New Testament authors, many of whom were Jews in the diaspora that were not in Judea and Israel, and so they're all over the place in the broader Greek speaking world. People like Paul and Luke, who wrote primarily for a non-Jewish Greek speaking community. And there's no surviving original manuscript of the New Testament in any other language. So if we're going to try and understand the meaning of what Jesus or the apostles are saying, we have to like go to the original Greek to try and understand, is the King James version or whatever English version that's a translation of the Greek, is that the right translation of the word? Because we're getting this like third hand, right? Jesus is talking in Aramaic and Paul or Luke or whoever are writing in Greek. And then we've got the King James's scholar dudes that are making their attempt to write in English. So we're getting like second, third hand. We're playing the telephone game. Let's go back at least to the Greek. It's not the actual language in which it was spoken, but it's the next language in which it was being communicated. So from this verse, Matthew chapter 5, verse 25, when it says to agree with your adversary, there is a Greek word that was used by these scholars to translate it into the word agree. And it's pronounced like eunoeo. I think I'm getting that pretty close. In the New Testament, that word appears only in this single verse. So we can't really get additional context from the New Testament itself. It does appear outside the New Testament in the Greek language and different, literature and so forth. But in the New Testament, it only appears here. So if you go to the Greek, if you go to these Greek dictionaries trying to understand, okay, what does this word actually mean from the Greek, the word that they chose and that the King James guys and other translators have said means agree, is there a different or alternate meaning with this Greek word? And it turns out that there is, that this word can also mean or does mean to be well-minded, to reconcile. There's that word from earlier, to reconcile yourself, to have kind thoughts for, or to be well disposed for, right? So if you're being well-minded, you're reconciling, you're having kind thoughts for the other person, suddenly it takes on new meaning. Because again, if we bring our modern understanding and context and definitions, we're taking away totally different meanings. If you go to the dictionary today and you look up what does it mean to agree, right? Agree with thine adversary. Okay, what does it mean to agree? Today's definitions of that English word are to have the same opinion about something, to concur, to consent to do something that has been suggested by another person. You're agreeing to, that activity. That is a yielding of the mind. If you're consenting to do something, you are having the same opinion. You're going along with the same action. It's a melding of the minds. It's an agreement of an idea or an action. And that, I don't believe, I'm choosing to go with some of these other Greek variants that seem to suggest something different. Jesus is not saying to, in the modern context, agree with our adversary, to have the same opinion about them, to consent to anything they're doing, not to their ideas, their actions, none of that. It's not saying go along with that, support it, get involved with it, consent to it, tolerate it, none of that. It appears instead to be saying, even if you have this adversary, have kind thoughts for them. Be well disposed for them. Be well-minded. Try to reconcile yourself. Not in any way agreeing to what they're doing or appeasing them or consenting or sharing their ideas. No. Simply, basically, loving your enemy, your adversary. In Romans 12, Paul says, if it be possible, as much as lieth in you, live peaceably with all men. And all men certainly includes your adversary. Of course, Jesus, going back to Matthew 5, taught, love your enemies, bless them that curse you, do good to them that hate you, and pray for them which despitefully use you and persecute. This was radical stuff then. It's radical stuff now. And to me, this agree with thine adversary really is only this. It's to have a loving disposition towards all men, even those who oppose you, even though those who are your adversary. Now, I will not share with you the story of what happened driving literally just yesterday on the road when this crazy lady cut me off and really upset me, right? I am not holding myself up here as some model, whatever, but trying to understand what I'm expected to do, what is being taught to us, how we are to understand Jesus's words in practice. Right? Not just, okay, I read the Sermon on the Mount, let's move on with our day and whatever. It's like, no, I want to actually try and really understand what Jesus is saying, what he's teaching. We, of course, have the benefit of, the Book of Mormon, Doctrine and Covenants. We have additional teachings from the Lord to kind of meld some of this together and try and figure out how they all complement and what's really being said. But absent that exposition from church leaders or others to really try and understand this, we're left to wonder, okay, to what extent are we supposed to agree with our adversary? So I really like going to this Greek and saying, forget the English word agree. What is this not original, but what does the Greek mean from the Aramaic? What were they trying to say that Jesus actually said? And so reconcile yourself with your adversary. You don't have to share their opinions. You don't have to consent to their actions. You don't have to in any way tolerate or support what they're doing or what they believe. You just want to have this kind of loving disposition. You want to love your enemies, bless them that curse you, and so forth. Paul also said in Ephesians 4 to let not the sun go down upon your wrath. I thought that was really fascinating, right? Basically just God doesn't want us to have the spirit of contention. We ought to contend for truth. We ought to contend against the kingdom of the devil, the church of the devil, right? We ought to stand for truth, even and in a sense, perhaps resist evil, even though in some ways Jesus is saying resist not evil and giving us these kind of countercultural contexts to really make sure that what we're doing, even when we're standing up for what's true, even when we're trying to, defend the faith or whatever, that we are doing it in a loving way, that we love God and man, that our hearts are in the right place, that it is not born out of animosity or antipathy or pride, right? Or the feelings I was having in the car yesterday with this crazy lady I was having to deal with, right? None of that. It's that love is paramount across all of these actions. Jesus wants us to love, period. And put simply. Now I'll wrap with just one other little thought, because when I was asked by this individual, I did the musing on contention, and this person's like, I don't understand that. What does it mean to, agree with your adversary? And so as I was reflecting on that, there's a similar-ish verse that came to mind, or rather two verses, one from the New Testament, one from the Doctrine and Covenants. And from Luke chapter 16, we get the following. Make to yourselves friends of the mammon of unrighteousness, that when ye fail, they may receive you into everlasting habitations. Or from the modern Revelation, section 82, make unto yourselves friends with the mammon of unrighteousness, and they will not destroy you. This seems to add a little bit of a different light about, or different angle on the importance of being reconciled even to your adversary, so that you don't get hauled in front of the judge. This very kind of strategic approach to existence and communication and even spreading the gospel, right? It seems, at least in part, to justify some of the church's historical decisions about trying to be reconciled, even with, the Nazis and others, right? You see why the organization, the institution, may be taking some of these positions, to make friends with the mammon of unrighteousness, to be reconciled with your adversaries, so that you don't have the sparks, grow into a big fire. It seems to suggest, even as us individuals, in not resisting evil, in loving our enemies, and praying for those who despitefully use us, in agreeing with our adversaries, that maybe there's a strategic component there as well, about operating in a world full of adversaries. And strategically, does it make sense to kind of keep your enemies close, type of thing, right? Make to yourselves the friends with the mammon of unrighteousness. Agree with your adversaries in the sense that you're being reconciled with them. I think of like a silly example that just popped in my head, but when I was a missionary in Honduras, you got all these gang members all over the place, and we'd buy them like some soda or whatever, and just kind of keep friendly. And they knew that the church wouldn't pay any ransom, and that we were all broke, and so they kind of left us alone, and they were being evil and doing other stuff and killing and hurting and whatever other people. But we were chill, and we were able to go about our business. And so maybe there's an element there that for us, as we operate in a fallen world full of adversaries, that we want to be reconciled, we want to be loving, and we can still stand for truth. I think where a lot of people struggle is that they go down this strategic path, right? Or even the institution. It's like, okay, let's make friends with the mammon of unrighteousness, and let's agree with our adversary and be reconciled. But it becomes, I think, my perspective is, it becomes very difficult after having that, making those friends and being reconciled with these adversaries, to then still stand up for what is true and right. You see it with parents whose kids come out as like trans or whatever, and suddenly the parents who before were, champions of the proclamation, are now like, oh, well, I love my kid, and therefore I'm tossing out the proclamation. And you see people whose loyalties are challenged, whose positions are undermined because of the interpersonal connections that they make, whether it's with their family members or the friends of the mammon of unrighteousness that they're making, or what have you. It's very hard to stand for something. You see this in the political process, right? You get the kind of good old boy network, the go along to get along. You scratch my back, I'll scratch yours. And it becomes, you're like friendly with all these people, even people who are on the other side of the so-called aisle, people that you vehemently disagree with in principle. But the more you're kind of making friends and reconciling yourself, it's very hard to still stand firmly for principle. I think that is kind of the crux or the challenge for us in, yes, let's be reconciled with our adversaries, so that the sparks don't grow into these big flames and cause us problems. But notwithstanding that kind of strategic decision, we need to still, stand for truth. We need to waste and wear out our life, bringing the light, hidden things of darkness to light, even if it pisses off the very adversaries that we're still trying to be reconciled. This is admittedly like confusing, seemingly conflicting stuff. And how do you navigate a world full of these fallen people that you're going to alienate and piss off if you stand firmly and say one thing, but then, hey, we want to be reconciled? And I think one part is to make it about the idea and not the individual, right? To not attack a person, but attack a principle. And granted, a lot of these individuals and people identify very closely with those ideas or those principles. And so they take it as a personal insult if you're just trying to, so you can do the best that you can, but still people are going to take offense or whatever. This is like tricky stuff. I am not an expert here. I would love, in fact, in the comments, advice and counsel from all y'all. It's like, how do we navigate this in today's world? How do we stand firmly for truth while being reconciled with our adversaries, while not yielding the mind, not consenting, not having the same opinions about them, but to just be well-minded, to have kind thoughts for them, right? To love your enemy and pray for those who despitefully use you. This is challenging stuff. I got a lot to learn here, but I really liked encountering that Greek kind of more original definition, because it helps me understand a little bit better. I'm not being asked by Jesus to have the same opinion as my adversary. I'm not being asked to consent to do something with my adversary, to support them or tolerate their bad actions or ideas. Rather, I just need to love. I need to be well disposed to my adversary. I need to be reconciled. I at least need to do my part to be reconciled to them. They have agency. They can decide whether or not to reciprocate or whatever. Fascinating stuff. I got a lot to learn here, but I really appreciated the question from this individual to poke a little bit at that last musing about contention, to say, all right, well then what does Jesus mean here? And it wasn't until I came across that Greek word where I was like, oh, okay, there's I think it's some different meaning here that is getting lost in translation. And we say agree in English, and of course we know what agree means, and therefore we think that Jesus was saying this. It's like this horrendous linguistic game of telephone where every translation and every set of scholars, right, we believe the Bible as far as it's translated correctly, and you go from the Aramaic and whatnot to the Greek to the Hebrew, Old Testament to the English. Like it's hard to really try and filter through and say, what is Jesus actually trying to teach? Let me know in the comments your thoughts, anything I missed, or how do you think we ought to deal with this, to being well disposed and reconciled to our adversary despite standing firm for truth? I'd love your inputs and thoughts in the comments, and I'll see you there.